So the concept of deprioritization, um, that concept is rooted in a lot of the history of vulnerability management. And when we say, when we look back historically, most customers, when they set up a vulnerability management program, even if they, and then even a larger style, risk-based style program, um, one of the things that is important here is that there was not a really good consensus on what actually is a threat or not. That's actually where the beginnings of things like the MITRE CVE list and those kind of publicly focused, publicly available resources. They were designed to standardize everybody, to get everybody in agreement, to agree on a rating scale, and one of the challenges with that is, and this has been proven kind of historically as things like the CVSS scale has evolved. Um, CVSS does have an inherent bias towards higher scores. So in other words, it's not, the vulnerabilities that we find, it tends to overrate them. And that is, some of that is just a failing of the actual system itself, the rubric that they're using. Some of it is also the fact that CVSS scores are really an aggregate of many different people and organizations scoring these vulnerabilities. And what we found is that when customers were basing their program, they had to base it on something. So they based it on CVSS to decide what needed to be fixed, what needed to be prioritized, and making sure that the worst problems are getting addressed first. And that worked pretty well. But over time, one of the issues is that as vulnerability management vendors evolved their platforms and increased the functionality and the types of scanning they could do, one of the challenges is that they were using the same scale. And inherently, what ended up happening is the biases that were baked into the CVSS uh, scoring ended up getting baked into the way vendors are providing prioritization. And the net effect of that over time was vulnerability. If I'm a customer and I scan the environment, the vulnerabilities that I find were, statistically were always being graded higher and higher priority. And even in instances where there are human analysts that are reviewing this data, there's a bit of human psychology here that nobody wants to say, oh, don't worry about that, and then their company gets hit by that vulnerability in a month. So there's always this bias that if you're not sure, you always push it higher in priority. So the problem that organizations ended up having was that as this bias kind of crept in to the management programs, more and more vulnerabilities kept getting pushed higher and higher up in priority, to the point where customers quite literally had more vulnerabilities than they had the ability to deal with in a reasonable maintenance window. Um, so the pushback started coming a few years ago, where we started seeing, okay, well, I've got too many problems getting flagged as high emergency, high priority. So what do I do about that? And what a lot of vendors and what a lot of customers started doing is they started looking at other metrics to help kind of whittle that list down. So one area that customers started looking at was the introduction of threat intelligence into this process. So, utilizing either their own internal intelligence, if they have the resources to have those types of analysts, or looking at third-party vendors that would provide um, analysis of vulnerabilities, but correlate that to a lot of the activity that they were seeing out in the public internet. So that's where a lot of the kind of natural language processing and a lot of the analysts that were, scraping Twitter and scraping other social media and dark web and that kind of stuff. The reason why they do that, it gives us an idea of what is the status of that vulnerability. Is anybody exploiting it? Does an exploit even exist? Is anybody running an active campaign against it? So that became one way to improve the prioritization, or improve the way that you're classifying vulnerabilities. The other way was to start looking at it from the context of your organization and start to understand what exactly the assets meant to the organization. And that's kind of a slippery concept, because it depends on exactly what you do as an organization and what the business values their assets at. So for some organizations, it could be based on regulatory requirements, could be based on revenue generation, could be based on the data that it stores if it's got sensitive data. um, Different definitions for different organizations, but there was also this kind of parallel effort to look at the assets that they were scanning with vulnerabilities to say, okay, what does this asset really mean to the business, and is it important or not? Because if it's not important, even if it has a critical vulnerability or a high level CVSS rated vulnerability, I may not really want to bother with it immediately. It may not be a high emergency for me to fix it on this low priority asset. So those two concepts in parallel were started getting applied to that. But in actuality, what's ended up happening is that when you start applying threat intelligence and business context to your vulnerability lists, what ends up happening is that you start to push vulnerabilities and instances of vulnerabilities down in priority. So essentially, your vulnerability scan products are going to put a large amount of vulnerabilities high in the priority list and say, go fix these 10,000 vulnerabilities. But adding all of this other contextual information about the vulnerability or about the asset that it's on allows companies to come in and say, okay, well, this is a bad vulnerability, but it's not being exploited and it's on a low importance asset to the business. So I don't need to fix that right now. And in fact, a lot of those types of vulnerabilities will get addressed when companies go through and do their normal patching maintenance. Typically once a month, once a quarter, they'll go through, they'll apply all the updated patches, and they will fix those as part of just normal operations. The trick to prioritization is getting really whittling that list down of problems that you need to address today. Um, that you need to have out of band patching or emergency maintenance being done on systems, getting that list as small as possible so that can become actionable and that it's driven by real data that matters to the organization is critical to any RBVM program. But the net effect of this at the end of the day, we want to look at all these vulnerabilities that are being flagged as high and critical and need to be fixed right now, and we want to apply common sense to this. We want to apply the organization's understanding of that problem to make sure that they're being as effective with resources, not fixing problems that are of lesser importance to them. So yeah, deprioritization, that's kind of fundamental to what NorthStar is doing with the Navigator product.